Smooth operations on the first day of restoration of quarantine travel between Hong Kong and the mainland. The resumption of turbojet service between Hong Kong and Macau. And many Chinese nationals fly back home from overseas as control measures are lifted. Hello and welcome to TVB News. The first stage of the restoration of quarantine-free travel between Hong Kong and the mainland began today. Most of the travelers going to the mainland today passed through the Lok Ma Chau spur line control point. Authorities said the border crossings went smoothly. Timothy Lee tells us more.
Next station, Lok Ma Chau.
At 5:30 this morning, the first train going to Lok Ma Chau station was almost full, with excited passengers keen to visit the mainland, with many of them having waited 3 years for today. This man said he arrived earlier because he was worried about too many people on the train. He noted there were no empty seats left on board the train.
Lok Ma Chau, end of the East Rail Line.
Many travelers expressed similar enthusiasm for the relaxed traveling measure.
I've been waiting for this day for a long time. Like, I can directly go back to my home without quarantine for many days. And also without applying for the quota of the hotel.
For the first time in 3 years, I'm going back to mainland China. And for the last time I went back to China, and I have to get 14 days of quarantine, so it's a tough journey. So this time it's really relaxing.
Ronald, who has not seen his spouse on the mainland since 2019, was among today's crowds.
First of all, to see my wife after 3 years, then also for my business, which is still in Guangzhou. So everything's good. Hopefully this year will be very good for everybody. I'm not worried about it. I'm vaccinated, fully vaccinated.
Travelers going to the mainland via the Lok Ma Chau spur line control point made up around 70%. That's around 35,000 of the daily quota of 50,000 people allowed into the mainland. Travelers could choose to use the self-service kiosk to save time. Responding to the surge in travelers, the Immigration Department has boosted its manpower and arranged separate queues for Hong Kong residents and tourists from the mainland at the checkpoint. With thousands of people traveling between the mainland and the city via Lok Ma Chau station today, the MTR said it has deployed an additional 300 staff to handle the people flow at the station. Travelers are also reminded to prepare a negative PCR test result within 48 hours before crossing the border. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
Chief Executive John Lee visited the Lok Ma Chau spur line control point this morning to monitor the first day of the resumption of quarantine-free border travel. He said he was pleased with the operations, and he added that authorities would closely monitor the situation to see if a review of the quota would be needed. Mimosa Ngai reports.
The Lok Ma Chau checkpoint reopened today. Chief Executive for Administration John Lee, Chief Secretary Eric Chen, and other officials arrived at the checkpoint to see if everything worked there.
今朝係幾點啊？幾點黃標期啊？今朝6點半黃標期。OK，努力工作喎嚇！哇，好多市民啊，真係好期待今日嘅。咁我哋都希望樣順暢。
Lee checked the immigration inspection counters, as well as the customs clearance process. Lee also chatted with some travelers. While John Lee said he believed the 15,000 slots for crossing the border are adequate, he said there could be changes in the quota depending on how the situation evolves.
我哋要睇多幾日啦，同埋睇下喺春節前同春節後市民整體嘅安排會係點。
Though some residents hailed the border reopening, Others are concerned about the COVID situation across the border.
After the long wait, I think it's a step in the right direction, to open up more Hong Kong.
From what I understand, the COVID situation risk is still very high in mainland China, so I don't have any plans to visit mainland anytime soon.
Chief Executive John Lee said the quota is still not fully booked for the few days leading up to the Lunar New Year, which is the peak period. The MTR said it has increased the frequency of trains to the border to satisfy the demand. Mimosa Nai, TVB News.
Besides Lok Ma Chau, several other channels are available for traveling to the mainland. Timothy Lee again.
Even before daybreak, people were already waiting at the Shenzhen Bayport, which has a quota of 10,000 per day at the first stage of border reopening. Many travelers were going to the mainland to visit family. Some encountered difficulties when filling in health information using an app, which is part of the procedure. But most were happy to travel. The entire process of going through various authorities took about 1 hour and 10 minutes. Once outside the checkpoint, long-distance buses are available to take travelers to various destinations. Another channel is traveling by the so-called Gold Bus using the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, which resumed 24-hour service today. The first bus departed early this morning, carrying 27 passengers to Zhuhai. Passengers were delighted now that quarantine is no longer needed. There is no quota, but passengers should first buy tickets online. As for private vehicles, there is a quota of 1,000 each day. Marine traffic to Macau also resumed. The first turbojet, carrying about 130 passengers, arrived at Taipa in Macau before 9 this morning. Passengers were delighted they could make the trip. Timothy Lee, TVB News.
On the first day of the border reopening, some cross-border families were finally able to reunite for the first time since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Christy Khan has more.
Over the past 3 years, some cross-border families were separated by various travel restrictions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But today, these pandemic curbs, including the mandatory quarantine requirements, came to an end for travelers wanting to return to the mainland. The resumption of restriction-free travel is a major step towards ending China's stringent zero-COVID policy. Mr. Yin, a Shenzhen resident who has been working in Hong Kong during the pandemic, could embrace his son at the border for the first time in years without the need to spend days in isolation at mainland quarantine facilities. This morning, Mr. Yin and his wife took the first train to Lok Ma Chau station just to meet their son, who is living in the mainland. His wife said they woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning to catch the first train. And Mr. Yin said he hopes free cross-border travel can resume soon, so he can visit his son at any time of the day. Meanwhile, the reopening of the border also prompted some Hong Kong residents to arrive at the Futian border checkpoint early in the morning. Several cross-border couples could at last meet each other in person after a lengthy separation because of pandemic curbs. Some retailers in Shenzhen were excited by the reopening of the border, like this woman. She said she misses customers from Hong Kong very much, and she hopes the Lowwood control point can resume operations soon to attract more travelers to visit the mainland. To facilitate the resumption of cross-border travel, Shenzhen Metro has arranged more manpower to offer assistance to commuters. Christy Khan, TVB News.
Many Chinese residents from overseas rushed to return to the mainland after pandemic control measures in China were lifted from today. It was the first time in 3 years that crowds could be seen at Beijing Capital International Airport, with people waiting for family members returning from abroad. Arrivals in the airport no longer have to undergo quarantine or take PCR tests, as Chinese authorities earlier announced that the country would reopen its border and remove pandemic curbs from January 8th. On the first day of the reopening of the border, a total of 8 flights landed at Beijing Capital International Airport, from overseas as well as Hong Kong and Macau. Airlines said more passenger flights will gradually resume in the future. And the government announced the Leave Home Safe mobile app ceased operations starting today. As the city continues to loosen its COVID restrictions, authorities announced that the Leave Home Safe app will no longer be updated. The mobile app's hotline and its 25 mobile support stations have also stopped providing services. But residents should keep their Leave Home Safe app on their mobile phones if it contains their vaccination records and PCR testing registration code. Quarantine-free travel to and from the mainland resumed today, but with certain requirements. Government Health Advisor David Hui said on a TVB program that how quickly the requirements will be relaxed should depend on whether there is a subsequent rise in local infections, leading to many severe cases.
Well, we need time to observe this. It is possible the number of cases may increase. With the initial opening of the border, we just need a bit of time to observe whether the number of severe cases has increased a lot and whether this would overwhelm the local healthcare system. I think we should do it in stages. With dropping of the vaccine pass, the local community elderly who have not received vaccine before, they are also out in the community. So in recent days, you can see the number of severe cases also has increased a bit.
Hui also said there could be further relaxation of the city's remaining anti-pandemic measures. He suggested one option is the removal of the requirement to wear masks outdoors. But he said the mask mandate should remain through the winter. The controversy continues over testing requirements being imposed on Chinese travelers by foreign governments, most recently Germany and Sweden. This as Beijing continues to relax its zero COVID policies. On Saturday, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock urged citizens to avoid unnecessary travel to China. She noted the rise in coronavirus cases in the country and said China's health system is overburdened. The German regulation also allows for spot checks on arrival. Germany, like other European nations, will test wastewater from aircraft for possible new virus variants. The measures come in force at midnight Monday and are due to last until April 7th. Authorities in Belgium began COVID testing on wastewater from planes arriving from China on Saturday. The first plane tested in Brussels was a Hainan Airlines flight from Beijing. A Chinese government spokesperson says the testing requirements aren't science-based and has threatened unspecified countermeasures. And still ahead, fighting in Ukraine as Russia ends a unilateral ceasefire. 2 subway trains collide in Mexico City, leaving 1 dead and almost 60 injured. And a sinking Indian town in the Himalayas. Welcome back. Ukraine says at least 1 person was killed in the east during overnight bombing by Russian forces after Moscow ended a unilateral ceasefire. Russia has vowed to resume its attacks on Ukraine and not stop until victory is achieved. Meanwhile, Orthodox Christians in both countries celebrated their Christmas, which falls on January 7th. Nazvi Karim reports.
It was a ceasefire in name only. Shellfire echoed on the near-deserted streets of Bakhmut in the eastern region of Donetsk, the scene of the most intense fighting of Russia's war with Ukraine. While Russia said it would adhere to the self-declared 36-hour ceasefire during the Orthodox Christians' Christmas celebrated on January 7th, Moscow admitted to retaliating to attacks from Ukraine, which had rejected any ceasefire agreement. The shelling gave Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky an opportunity to denounce Russia, saying the ceasefire was simply a ploy. Away from the front lines, many Ukrainians rejoiced on Christmas Day at Kiev's Cathedral of the Assumption, which Ukraine's main church recently seized from a rival domination with alleged ties to Russia. The cathedral is part of the 980-year-old Kiev-Pechursk Lavra monastery complex and worshippers celebrated its return with a sermon conducted in the Ukrainian language for the first time. Today we simply return. 30 years after renewing our history and gaining our independence, we return to our holy places, to our spiritual sources, this worshipper said. In Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin attended an Orthodox Christmas Eve service at the Annunciation Cathedral. This as Orthodox Christians packed churches around the world, including Moscow's Christ the Savior Cathedral. Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill led the Christmas Divine Liturgy, the first Christmas service in the main cathedral of Russian Orthodoxy since the start of the war. In a Christmas address, Kirill accused Kiev of trying to ruin the pro-Moscow branch of the Orthodox Church. Meanwhile, Zelensky hailed the United States for its commitment to supplying Kiev with armored vehicles. It's part of a new $3 billion weapons package that includes Bradley fighting vehicles. Nazvi Karim, TVB News.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak gathered government ministers, medics and health service managers on Saturday for talks aimed at fixing a national health service crisis. The crisis has seen thousands of patients stranded outside overflowing hospitals. Daniel Rell tells us more.
Rishi Sunak's Conservative government said it was bringing together the best minds from health and care sectors to help share knowledge and discuss practical solutions to the National Health Service crisis. Britain's health system is under extreme pressure. It has been hit by rising demand for care after the relaxation of pandemic restrictions, as well as a surge in flu and other winter viruses. That's in addition to staff shortages from pandemic burnout and a post-Brexit drought of European workers in the UK. Thousands of hospital beds are currently being occupied by people who are fit to be discharged but have nowhere to go because of a lack of long-term care facilities. That has led to ambulances stuck outside hospitals with patients who can't be admitted and people with health emergencies waiting hours for ambulances to arrive. A cost of living crisis fueled by soaring food and energy bills has left some health workers struggling to make ends meet. Nurses and ambulance crews have staged walkouts, part of the country's biggest wave of strikes in decades. The pressures have renewed a long-running debate about how to fund and run the NHS. The opposition Labour Party has accused the Tories, who have been in power since 2010, of consistently underfunding the health service or seeking to privatise it by stealth. The government says health funding continues to rise in real terms. It says public sector workers are being offered pay increases, but that it can't afford to give out raises to match inflation, which hit 11.1% in October. Health union leaders are due to meet the government on Monday in an attempt to end the strikes. NHS workers warned of the grave situation and called on the Conservative government to commit to a clear funding plan.
This is always the toughest time of year for us. Every year it gets a little bit tougher. At some point something has to change because we can't keep doing this.
What would really help is a commitment to that funding on an ongoing basis for the medium and long term, because that enables providers for residential care and domiciliary care to plan for the future with confidence.
Dan Orell, TVB News.
A young woman was killed and 57 injured in a train collision on Mexico City's metro on Saturday morning. The cause of the crash is unclear. Matthew Bray reports.
The accident happened on Line 3 of the Mexican capital's metro system on Saturday morning at 9:21 a.m. between the Potrero and La Raza stations inside a tunnel. It is thought one train ran into the back of another train. 4 people were trapped in the wreckage for a period of time, including one of the train drivers. Emergency services, including soldiers, were at the scene. Dozens of police swarmed into nearby stations while ambulances and rescue teams arrived to treat the injured. The mayor of Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, was also at the scene. 4 people were trapped and it took some time to rescue them, she said. The driver of the train is the most seriously hurt. 57 people were injured, mostly with minor injuries, but unfortunately one person died. But the mayor did not specify why the accident had occurred. Eyewitnesses on the train said the impact was strong. People were thrown forward after the rear carriage was smashed into. The power went out, people started screaming and smoke began to start suffocating passengers. It was roughly 30 minutes until help arrived. Mexico City has seen other incidents on its metro. In May 2021, an elevated section of Line 12 came down, killing 26 and injuring nearly 100. An investigation blames structural failures in the construction process. 10 officials were charged with homicide, injury and damage to property. Matthew Bray, TVB News.
subsidence or land sinking has forced Indian authorities to temporarily relocate hundreds of people in a Himalayan town. A temple collapsed and large cracks opened up in over 600 houses because the land is sinking. Residents of Joshimath said they started noticing cracks in houses in 2021 after floods in the region. A state disaster management official said the cause seems to be the faulty drainage system, which led to water seepage under the houses. The temple town sits at an altitude of nearly 2,000 meters and is a key Hindu pilgrim and trekking site. Roads are also cracked, hampering the movement of vehicles. That is the news. Pearl Magazine is up shortly. Bye for now.